What's up, everybody? And today we are reacting to the unmaking of India, how the British impoverished the world's richest country. This is a video that is going to be hard to watch as a Brit, right? As a former Royal Marine who's in the British military. But at the same time, no matter how difficult something like this is to watch, it's important to acknowledge it. It's important to acknowledge the atrocities that my culture had on other cultures. Okay, does that mean I'm a bad person? No, it doesn't. It just means that I can look back on my history and make sure that that history is not repeated. Make sense? Why am I not focusing? Focus on me. Come here, camera. Get back over here. I think it's an important video to watch. I've watched a lot of videos on Hinduism and India recently, and I think to round it all up, it's important to do something like this. As a Brit, as a British person, especially someone who's in the Royal Marines Commandos, I think it's important to watch stuff like this to improve myself and collectively as a people. Make sense? There'll be a link down below to the original video. There'll also be a link down below to DREADNOUGht MEADERY, my project me and my brother are working on. If you're interested in that, please go check it out. It means a lot to me. And if you want to see more videos on India and Hinduism and stuff like that, and I did another video, I don't know whether it's up before or after this, probably after this tonight, on philosophy with Alan Watts. Check it out. It's a good one. Focus, camera. Focus. It's an important topic. All right, let's pop this up. Let's watch it. It's 16 minutes long. It's a bit longer than usual, and we'll have a bit of a chat about it, okay?
In the year 1700, India's share in the world's economy was an astounding 27%, more than all of Europe combined.
Damn.
250 years later, India's share had dropped to less than 3%, and its people were left impoverished. What happened? Strap in, adventurers. We're about to dive into a dark and messy history. Welcome to 18th century India.
Can I just say,
1707 CE, the death of...
Before we fully get into this, the amount of love, even though my people, the British, the history of my people have done atrocious things to India. I've made this content recently, and the amount of love in them comments of them videos is astounding. It just shows how loving the people of India actually are.
Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb sends the empire into a decades-long spiral. In his wake, an endless parade of weak princelings forced themselves upon the peacock throne. With the Mughal Empire teetering on the brink of collapse, regional powers jostle for supremacy. Land grabs and title claims, infighting and betrayal. India is vulnerable. The situation is so precarious that, in 1739, Persian Emperor Nadir Shah invades North India and sacks Delhi. During this period of disorder, the British sensed opportunity. Leveraging their unique advantages as a foreign power, they bribed and blasted their way into a dominant position in the subcontinent. India was no stranger to dealing with foreign aggression, but the British were not like those who had come before. They were not like Nadir Shah, who looted and simply left. Nor were they like the Huns, who, while shedding Gupta blood, became Indian themselves. Yes, the British were different, for they saw India as an inexhaustible gold mine whose resources were to be forever extracted. By the time India won its independence in 1947, its native institutions had been demolished, its economy de-industrialized, its trade networks severed, and its people more deeply divided by caste and creed. In just 200 years of colonial rule, the India that once inspired the world was unmade. The halcyon days of India are over. She has been drained of all the wealth she once possessed, and her energies have been cramped by a sordid system of misrule. The deliberate bleeding of India by the British was so extreme that famed American scholar Will Durant referred to it as the greatest crime in all of history.
Damn.
So let's pull back the curtain and see what India was like before colonialism. In the 19th century, the American J.T. Sunderland wrote about the India that the British found when they arrived.
God, like, colonialism is such a horrible thing. Like, it's so baffling how the mind of people back then thought that this was a good idea. Like, it's so unfathomable, right? That people thought, this is a good idea, we're going to do this. It just doesn't make sense. Or at least it doesn't to me as a person from, 2023. right, who has grown up with different philosophical ideas and perspectives on the world and traveled and seen different cultures and experienced different lands. It's just a bizarre perspective of ego and control. It's weird.
India was a far greater industrial and manufacturing nation than any in Europe or Asia. Her textile goods were famous all over the civilized world. So was her exquisite jewelry and her precious stones. So was her pottery, her porcelains and ceramics. So were her fine works in metal, iron, steel, silver, and gold. She had great
Basically, it was an incredible place of creativity and culture and art.
architecture, equal in beauty to any in the world. She had great merchants, businessmen, bankers, and financiers. She was not only a great shipbuilding nation, but had commerce and trade which extended to all civilized countries.
Wow.
That may seem like heavy-handed praise, but the record does show that pre-colonial India was a dominant manufacturing economy. Let's take a closer look at the textile, shipbuilding, and metalworking industries. India was a textile superpower for most of its long history. There were many textile centers in the subcontinent. Coastal Andhra was a block printing hub, for example, while Gujarat and Bengal were known for their high-end woven products. There was global demand for these items. In fact, India enjoyed a mind-blowing 25% share of the global textile trade by the mid-18th century.
Damn.
This thriving textile trade had knock-on effects for the entire economy. For example, the popularity of Indian textiles led to the creation of stable international distribution networks. By piggybacking on these networks, other Indian artisans could sell their goods worldwide at a reduced cost.
Wow.
As a result, many different industries flourished alongside the Indian textile industry. We know that international trade was conducted primarily along maritime routes, and so the Indian shipbuilding industry had developed into a behemoth too. A significant number of Indian ports were engaged in the shipbuilding industry. Dhaka, Mausalapatnam, Surat, Calicut, Quilon, and many, many others. Entire rural communities were involved in the production and processing of materials used to construct ships. Quality was paramount. Consider the Bengali merchant fleet in the early 17th century.
At this point, it's like, what could they not do? Do you know what I mean? They were incredible people. They still are. I mean, I'm not saying that they're not right now. Obviously, they are. In fact, I think it's more incredible the fact that India is bouncing back and becoming one of the biggest countries in the world again after something as atrocious as what the British did to them. I think that just goes to show how amazing this culture can bring people together. This type of culture somehow can create and develop incredible ways of living, so much so that it brings everyone as a collective, as a group of people, all up in one go, and it's shockingly impressive.
The fleet consisted of nearly 5,000 ships, each capable of carrying up to 500 tons of goods.
Wow.
These ships were constructed in Bengali ports by native artisans who had the skills to craft elaborate wood, iron, and brass fittings. According to one British maritime observer, Indian vessels combine elegance and utility and are models of fine workmanship. Merchant contracts indicate that Bengali ships were much more durable than English ships. Bengali ships had an average lifespan exceeding 20 years, while
Wow.
English ships were not known to last more than 12. Quite a difference. India was a longtime pioneer in the global steel industry. As early as the 6th century CE, crucible-formed steel, which came to be known as Wootz or Damascus steel in the West, was being produced for export by Indian blacksmiths, particularly along the Malabar coast and in the Deccan. Arab and European officers regularly imported blades from India. While these blades were purchased as wartime implements, they were so robust and beautifully crafted that they also served as a mark of high status in times of peace.
That's
Though
incredible.
we've barely scratched the surface, it should already be clear that India was a manufacturing juggernaut, a thriving exporter of high-quality goods to markets throughout the world. How did the British manage to unmake all of that? The fundamental principle of the British has been to make the whole Indian nation subservient to the interests and benefits of themselves. And so, once the British took power, they changed the entire dynamic of the Indian economy to suit their own interests.
Ugh.
The first step, dismantling all native industry. To start, they established a legal monopoly over Indian textile goods and cut off the export market, which immediately disrupted long-standing trade links. Having now made themselves the exclusive buyers of Indian textiles, the British then changed the way that they paid for those goods. Instead of using foreign currency, they paid using the tax revenues extracted from India. The Indian economy stagnated and prices
So it was just a constant loop. Oh my days.
collapsed. Skilled artisans, who once fueled the vibrant Indian economic engine, were now significantly poorer and more restricted than ever before. And it didn't stop there. Soon enough, British manufacturers lobbied their government to completely eliminate the competition from the Indian textile industry. See, despite the restrictions imposed on Indian industry, British manufacturers were still finding it difficult to compete with Indian products.
Yeah.
Company soldiers were sent to smash Indian looms. According to several different accounts, they even went around breaking the thumbs of weavers so that they could no longer ply their trade. But
oh my god. Like, how does someone think that that's okay? That is so evil.
that's not all. To ensure that the Indian textile industry could not recover, adapt, or innovate itself back into relevancy, the British imposed an absurdly harsh 80% tariff. This had an immediate catch-22 trap effect. Exporting goods from India to the UK was now economically unviable. But remember, Indians were restricted from selling to anyone else. Similar restrictions were imposed on nearly every branch of manufacturing in India. India was reduced to being a mere exporter of raw materials, like cotton and metal ore, so that the British could sell finished products back to Indians at a premium.
Oh my god.
We conquered India as an outlet for the goods of Britain. I'm not such a hypocrite to say that we hold India for the Indians. The colonial de-industrialization process was so complete that by 1947, only 0.7% of India was employed in any form of manufacturing. But skilled workers had to go somewhere, do something. The British monopoly on industrial production drove Indian artisans, merchants, builders, and others into agriculture en masse. In the words of Dr. Charles Hall, India's population has been thrown back upon the soil because Britain's discriminating duties have ruined every branch of native manufacture.
Oh, this is so painful to watch on how evil people are. Can you imagine what this country would have been like today, if this never happened? Can you believe it? It would be the hub of the world. It would be the hub of the world.
Rural wages cratered to historical lows, and in fact, the land itself could not sustain the influx of newly disenfranchised workers. Poor seasonal harvests and droughts gave way to catastrophic famines and mass poverty. With most Indians now converted into peasant cultivators, the British sought to exploit them further. They began to tax cultivators as the primary revenue source for the administration. Taxes were extreme, pegged at 50 to 80% of gross income, and calculated before the harvest.
Wow.
The result? Indian cultivators often owed more in taxes than they earned as income. The British knew how harsh this really was. They openly conceded that they were imposing the highest tax rates in the world, and that taxes were more than 3 times higher than they had ever been under Indian rulers.
Oh my
To
god.
add insult to injury, the British even bragged about it in Parliament. The Indians have been taxed to the utmost limit. Every province has been made a field for higher exaction, and it has always been our boast how greatly we have raised the revenue above that which the native rulers were able to extort.
That's shocking. That is so evil. Like, can you imagine if we just let this culture thrive?
Colonial taxes were so burdensome that 2/3 of the population in directly ruled British areas fled to the hinterlands, where native Indian lords could at least minimally protect them from financial depredation. The millions who stayed behind could hardly afford to pay taxes, and the situation was worsened by the fact that the British did not negotiate tax payments. Horrors were perpetrated under the guise of sinless mathematical neutrality. Tax defaulters were confined in cages and exposed to the burning sun. Fathers sold their children to meet the rising rates. Vulnerable peasants were physically tortured to pay up, and when they didn't have the means to pay, the British confiscated their farmland for themselves. Tens of millions of landless peasants were created for the first time in Indian history. By the end of the 19th century, India was Britain's largest source of revenue by far, its largest purchaser of exports, and a source of highly paid employment for both British civil servants and soldiers, and they were all paid for by Indian taxes. Many British officials freely acknowledged the exploitative nature of the colonial enterprise. In fact, a Prime Minister of the UK, the Marquess of Salisbury, himself admitted, "As India is to be bled of money, the lancet should be directed to those parts where the blood is congested."
Oh
And
my
just
god.
like that, India and its people were bled dry. The fundamental issue of British
I don't understand. Like, I get now why everyone hates England or Britain. I get it. I just don't understand why they thought this was okay. Like, I mean, guess that's colonialism, isn't it? At the end of the day, like this isn't the first instance of colonialism, and not the last either. The whole idea of it is just atrocious.
Overlordship was the fact that the British had no intention to become one with the land or to rule it as their own. The British saw India as innately and eternally foreign, and this justified their creation and maintenance of what scholars have referred to as an extractive colony. For comparison's sake, consider the Turkic peoples who invaded India and eventually formed the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire. Look, the Mughals were no heroes. They imposed unequal taxes, engaged in religious discrimination, plundered local treasuries, visited great violence upon their enemies, and exhibited a Persianized racial arrogance. But one thing is clear: India's wealth was preserved at a foundational level. After nearly 2 centuries of Mughal rule, India was still a dominant economic power, responsible for 27% of global trade. There's a simple reason for that. See, the Mughals had a foreign place of origin, Fergana, but they did not repatriate India's resources to their original homeland. India may not have been Fergana, but it had become their new home, and so their loyalties and energies were owed solely to India. Meanwhile, the British ruled India as disconnected tyrants. The bulk of the revenue from India wasn't reinvested in India. No. It was extracted and repatriated to their distant, foggy homeland.
It just shows because it didn't work. Britain's struggling right now. Britain is struggling. So all this torture and horrible, evil acts around the world didn't even help us in the end. And look at India now, thriving. India is doing amazing right now. Way better than Britain. Just shows, doesn't it? This evil stuff. It's not only is it horrifically bad, it doesn't work anyway. So they're just being evil for the sake of being evil. It's atrocious.
How much? Modern economists have estimated that the total amount of wealth that the British extracted from India is in the ballpark of $43 trillion.
Wow.
Yes, $43 trillion. When taxes are not spent in the country from which they are raised, they constitute an absolute loss and extinction of the whole amount withdrawn from the taxed country. The money might as well be thrown into the sea. Such is the nature of the tribute we have so long exacted from India. Apologists for colonial rule often point to the railways as some sort of extravagant counter to the argument of extraction and divestment. But as modern scholars have pointed out, the railways serve as evidence for how exploitative and inefficient British investment in India really was. First, there's the bold assumption that Indians would not have built railways, like the Japanese or others, either by importing the technology or by developing their own.
Let's be honest. Indian culture thrived with arts and crafts and architecture and design, and you saying they couldn't have just done this on their own is probably the most ridiculous statement ever. Ridiculous.
India had been far too advanced and cutting edge of civilization to not keep up had it been given the opportunity to do so. When the British came to India, the country was the leader of Asiatic civilization. Japan was nowhere. Now, in 50 years, Japan has revolutionized her history with the aid of modern arts of progress, and India, burdened by 150 years of English rule, is condemned to tutelage. But let's ignore that for now. Initially, the Indian railways were positioned as a grand investment scheme for British shareholders. The government guaranteed substantial returns of at least 5% per year, and when the revenues were not enough to pay out these returns, Indian taxpayers covered all the losses. Because of these taxpayer-backed guarantees, construction of the railways was extremely inefficient. Here's a fun stat. Every mile of Indian rail cost £18,000 to construct, as compared to £2,000 for the same mile built in the United States. All the elements of railway construction, steel, wagons, gears, engines, and more, were produced by British manufacturers.
It was ineffective and ridiculous to pay a premium for that.
Given an opportunity to produce their own manufactured alternatives, because the British government imposed restrictions that prevented Indians from competing. Worse
So
still,
stupid.
The central purpose of the railways was to assist the British enterprise in the exploitation of the natural resources of India.
Oh my
In fact,
God.
the railways made it possible for the British to export enormous amounts of grain and other agricultural products, which sparked and exacerbated famines. Over the course of British rule in India, an estimated 35 million preventable deaths were caused by famines. That's millions more than those killed under Stalin or Mao, and that's 5 times more than the Holocaust. The British were directly responsible for this. They mass exported Indian foodstuffs to Britain and other countries in Europe, even during drought periods. Food in India became too expensive for peasants to afford. According to Dr. Charles Hall, India starves so that its annual tax revenue to England may not be diminished by $1. There is plenty of grain in India. The trouble is that the people have been ground down till they are too poor to buy it. The British had no interest in provisioning for Indian lives. Famine non-intervention was official government policy. How ironic, given that heavy-handed British intervention and market manipulation is what sparked the famines in the first place. And when good people, Indians and foreigners, worked together to help famine-affected peasants, the British government made efforts to stop them. They were furious that the government's own failures were being highlighted. Don't believe me? Listen to this British officer in his own words. Scores of corpses were tumbled into old wells because the deaths were too numerous for the relatives to perform funeral rites. Mothers sold their children for a single meal. Husbands flung their wives into ponds to escape the torment of seeing them perish from hunger. But amid these scenes of death, the British government in India was unmoved.
Oh my
Newspapers
God.
were persuaded into silence. Strict orders were given to civilians. Do not acknowledge that civilians are dying of hunger. And if you think that Indians would have done a worse job, consider this. There hasn't been a single large-scale Indian famine in the 70-plus years since British rule ended.
It's so horrible.
Not one. Independent
It's nearly
India
finished,
has
I'll
its
talk
flaws,
after it.
But it has been overwhelmingly better at providing for the care, safety, and prosperity of its own people. And now you know.
Holy, that's hard to watch. It's really hard to watch as someone who's British. And it's weird because as a Brit, you have these sparks of pride of being British when you're watching the football or, you know, anything. Any little tiny thing, you sometimes have this little bit, oh, I'm proud to be English, I'm proud to be British. And then all of a sudden you get this flood of realization and like, realization that your culture has done horrendous things around the world. Horrendous things that are unspeakable. And it makes me wonder where that spark of colonialism started. Like, where did it start? Why is my camera not focusing? Come on, camera, focus on me. Did it start when Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings and the Celts were all fighting each other for land, trying to unite Britain? And once they did that, they wasn't satisfied, so they tried to do more of it? Like, where did it start? And why did they think it was an okay thing to do? Right? Something that I haven't really learned, and it sucks because you don't really learn about this in school in Britain. You learn about the atrocities of colonialism, but it doesn't go into detail. It's easy to just be like, colonialism's bad, right? It's easy to sit back and be like, colonialism's bad, and be kind of arrogant and ignorant to the actual details. But then when you watch videos like this and tell you the realization of how bad it actually was, it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking to know that your culture has done something like that. And I think India. So let's move away from England and colonialism for a second, and let's talk about India, right? And how special that place is, because before colonialism, it was the hub of the world, and after colonialism, it is already becoming one of the hubs of the world. It's already becoming. I think it is the fastest rising nation in the world when it comes to economics, for art, literature, for growth, for culture, for religion, all these different things. It's the fastest country, I'm pretty sure, in the world, or the biggest or quickest growing country in the world. So it just goes to show how quickly they can bounce back as a people. And it makes me, honestly, it makes me wonder what that country would have been like if it didn't have that giant setback of the British. Like how much bigger and better that country would have been than any other country in the world. And it makes me really sad and makes me ashamed of being British, unfortunately. I moved away from America back to Britain because I wanted a better life, but both countries are just, they've done atrocious things, and it's it doesn't reflect on me who I am as an individual, because obviously I think India is a fantastic place and I love the culture and the history and everything of it. It doesn't reflect on my family. But I think it's a big realization on how we need to educate future generations to prevent the cycle of history, because history is a wheel. It comes back, history repeats itself, right? Doesn't mean that Britain will do it again, but history in a way means that a country will do it again. If anything, America's kind of like not as bad as what Britain was back then, but definitely does take advantage of lesser known countries if they have oil, right? History does repeat itself, and I think the only way we're able to stop that is through teaching the next generation the atrocities of what it's caused. And so me as an individual who's British and has 2 beautiful children can only try my hardest to teach my children a good way of living their life and a respectable way of living their life. And I think one of the best ways to do that, in my opinion, is travel. I've traveled around the world. I've seen so many different cultures, so many different places. I've never been to India, and I would love to go to India. I think that's the best way of opening people's eyes as to why these cultures should be left to thrive, and you should help them thrive in whichever way you can without stepping on anyone's toes or getting involved yourself. And by that, it means just leaving them a fuck alone. I do not know, as a person, much about colonialism, and that's sad. That is sad. And I hope to educate myself more on it. If you've got any recommendations, let me know in the comments. To all my Indian friends who have been watching these videos, I love you, and I cannot get enough of your videos. I think you're amazing people, amazing culture, amazing everything. So, I love you all. If you enjoyed the video, please like it. And if you've learned something like I have, please like the video as well. Go over to the original video. There'll be a link down below. And go over to DREADNOUGHT MEADERY in the description. Other than that, I love you all. Have a wonderful day. Goodbye.